In this video, we will talk about the introduction of the Anti-Racism Data Act by the province of BC, which is the first of its kind in Canada to be co-developed with Indigenous peoples and aims to collect data on ethnic origin, ancestry, faith, ability and gender identity to identify gaps in programs and services and better meet the needs of Indigenous, Black and racialized British Columbians. The Anti-Racism Data Act was passed on June 2, 2022, after being informed by the thoughts of more than 13,000 British Columbians through engagement with Indigenous peoples and racialized communities, as well as key stakeholders such as the B.C. Human Rights Commissioner, First Nations Leadership Council, the BC Association of Aboriginal Friendship Centres and Métis Nation BC. It is one of the first pieces of legislation to be co-developed with Indigenous peoples under the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. The Act is intended to support the collection, use and disclosure of demographic information within BC for the purposes of identifying and dismantling systemic racism and advancing racial equity, particularly in policing, health care, and education. The Act focuses on 4 key areas. Continued collaboration with Indigenous peoples in a way that recognizes the unique identity of First Nations and Métis communities in BC, working with racialized communities in implementing the legislation, increasing transparency and accountability while preventing and reducing harms to Indigenous peoples and racialized communities, and requiring government to release data on an annual basis, and to periodically review the Act. The Act also establishes a provincial anti-racism data committee to collaborate with government on how data is collected and used. The committee consists of 11 members, including the chair, who are appointed by the minister responsible for anti-racism initiatives. The members represent diverse perspectives and experiences from Indigenous peoples and racialized communities. The committee has several duties, such as providing advice to government on data standards, data directives, research priorities, statistics or other information, reviewing public body compliance with the Act, identifying potential community harm arising from data collection or use, and promoting public awareness and education on anti-racism data initiatives. The Act also requires government to establish data standards for collecting demographic information from individuals who access public services or programs, issue data directives to public bodies to collect or disclose demographic information for specific purposes, set research priorities for analyzing demographic information to identify systemic racism or racial inequities, publish statistics or other information based on demographic information, and consult and cooperate with Indigenous peoples and racialized communities throughout these processes. The Act aims to break down barriers for people to access programs, ensure racialized people aren't disproportionately targeted, improve programs and services so more people feel safe getting the help they need, and create an opportunity to do better. The Act is a significant step towards addressing systemic racism in B.C. and creating a more inclusive and equitable society for all. The challenges and barriers that Indigenous, Black and people of color face in accessing public services such as health care, education, justice and social welfare, and how systemic racism and discrimination have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Systemic racism, also known as institutional racism, refers to the ways that whiteness and white superiority become embedded in the policies and processes of an institution, resulting in a system that advantages white people and disadvantages BIPOC/IBPOC. Systemic racism can affect every aspect of life for Indigenous, Black and people of color, including their access to public services such as health care, education, justice and social welfare. In BC, the provincial government has recognized the need to address systemic racism and discrimination in its programs and services. In May 2022, the government introduced the Anti-Racism Data Act, ARDA, which enables the safe collection and use of personal information for the purposes of identifying and eliminating systemic racism and advancing racial equity. The Act also requires the government to establish and publish research priorities every 2 years, and annually release statistics or other information related to systemic racism and racial equity. In May 2023, the government released 12 priorities for anti-racism research for 2023. These priorities were identified by people who are most impacted by systemic racism, including indigenous peoples and racialized communities. The research priorities cover areas such as racial diversity within the public service, interactions with the justice system, and how healthcare and education differ for various demographic groups. The government also announced that it will develop broader anti-racism legislation, which is expected to be introduced. In this legislation will aim to increase trust, transparency, and accountability with indigenous peoples and racialized communities through continued collaboration on data initiatives under the Act. However, systemic racism and discrimination are not new problems in B.C. They have been present for generations and have shaped the delivery of public services for indigenous, Black, and people of color. Moreover, the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the existing inequalities and vulnerabilities faced by these groups. For example, indigenous peoples have experienced higher rates of COVID-19 infection, hospitalization, and death than non-indigenous people in B.C. They have also faced barriers to accessing testing, vaccination, and culturally safe health care during the pandemic. Similarly, Black and people of color have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19 due to factors such as poverty, precarious work, overcrowded housing, lack of access to health information and services, and stigma and discrimination. In addition, indigenous, Black, and people of color have faced increased incidents of hate crimes, harassment, and violence during the pandemic. According to Statistics Canada, police reported hate crimes targeting Asian Canadians increased by 717% in Vancouver in 2020 compared to many of these incidents were motivated by anti-Asian racism linked to COVID. The pandemic has also highlighted the gaps and challenges in other public services such as education, justice, and social welfare for Indigenous, Black, and people of color. For instance, many students from these groups have faced difficulties with remote learning due to lack of access to technology, internet connection, academic support, and social interaction. Moreover, many families from these groups have struggled with food insecurity, income loss, mental health issues, and domestic violence during the pandemic. These examples show that systemic racism and discrimination are not only historical legacies but also present realities for Indigenous, Black, and people of color in B.C. They also show that the pandemic has worsened the situation for these groups by exposing and amplifying their vulnerabilities and marginalization. Therefore, it is crucial that the government takes action to address systemic racism and discrimination in its programs and services. The Anti-Racism Data Act is a step in this direction, but it is not enough. The government needs to use the data collected under the Act to inform policy changes that will improve the access and outcomes for Indigenous, Black, and people of color in public services such as health care, education, justice, and social welfare. The government also needs to work with these communities to ensure their voices are heard and their needs are met. Only then can B.C. move toward a more equitable society for all. Systemic racism is a pervasive and persistent problem that affects many aspects of society, including public services. In order to address systemic racism and advance racial equity, we need to have reliable and relevant data that can inform our policies and practices. That is why the B.C. government introduced the Anti-Racism Data Act in 2022, which enables the safe collection and use of personal information for the purposes of identifying and eliminating systemic racism and advancing racial equity. One of the key features of the Anti-Racism Data Act is the establishment of research priorities every 2 years, based on the input and recommendations of Indigenous peoples and racialized communities. These research priorities will guide the collection and analysis of data on how different demographic groups access and experience public services, such as health care, education, justice, and social participation. The first set of research priorities for 2023 to 2025 was released in May 2023, and it includes 12 areas of focus, such as racial diversity within the B.C. public service, interactions with the justice system, and how health care and education differ for various demographic groups. These research priorities will help us understand the barriers and challenges that Indigenous peoples and racialized communities face when accessing public services, as well as the opportunities and best practices that can improve their outcomes and well-being. However, data collection alone is not enough to fight systemic racism. We also need to ensure that we engage with Indigenous peoples and racialized communities to ensure respectful and ethical approaches to data sovereignty, analysis, and utilization. Data sovereignty refers to the right of Indigenous peoples and racialized communities to own, control, access, and protect their own data. This means that they should have a say in how their data is collected, stored, shared, and used, as well as how their data can benefit them. Engaging with Indigenous peoples and racialized communities also means that we need to respect their cultures, histories, values, and perspectives when collecting and analyzing data. We need to avoid imposing our own assumptions or biases on the data, and instead seek to understand the context and meaning behind the data. We also need to ensure that we use the data in a way that supports their self-determination, empowerment, and dignity. By collecting and using data in a respectful and ethical way, we can create more inclusive and equitable public services that meet the diverse needs of Indigenous peoples and racialized communities. We can also identify and eliminate systemic racism and discrimination that prevent them from fully participating in society. Data is a powerful tool to fight systemic racism, but only if we use it with care and respect.